At the end, we all seem to be needing to reparent ourselves. Remember that the unconscious is timeless. All the feelings and the strong emotions of the past can be renewed, and the forgotten feelings can be put aside, just by taste or smell or sound, which may have accompanied strong emotions. Christian or otherwise, an event of insignificant kind can trigger some past anger or pleasure or embarrassment. We must also remember that the memories of all the past experiences which were important to us are all stored within our brain cells, waiting to be released. So where are they? We find them accidentally or consciously. The past suddenly becomes present. There are no variety of ways or a single way to enter the past. A teacher, therapist, or a trusted friend becomes a surrogate parent, and who can make us feel safe so that we too can begin the journey. For the poor few, hypnosis becomes a time-ordered bridge. For others, meditation, perhaps a gentle form of self-hypnosis, allows us to turn inwards. The company of others with similar experiences may assist to build a bridge over the shame or fear that has been blocking our pathway. A whole group may change because we share that group identity, and those pathways for our own change opens up also. We will discuss this background journey in times to come. If those broken places are very deep and painful, the conscious mind must resist in order to keep functioning, just like the child who covers them up to be able to function and survive. Their being nice becomes more difficult to explore, and they need a more consistent process. However, the point of this journey does not heal, but recovers joyful and creative core of ourselves. It is true and spontaneous. Why are we talking about this, you might ask? Simply to show the importance of making the connections between past and present. But since we cannot know everything, however, we need to have faith in the future. One hopes that this is being mentioned in regard to reparenting self. They seem very unlikely, but one can start one simple exercise which I have conducted myself. Jotting down about the things you wanted that you received in your childhood or not. What shall we discover by doing this? What you should do for yourself. Exactly that. When we are old enough to have an education, the very first step towards self-esteem for many of us is not necessary to learn something new, but still to learn. In fact, we need to demystify what we have been told, and we should do it before we can value what or who we are. That on its own is very difficult. But the social bias and our upbringing, which was clearly very wrong, has helped us to misvalue our own selves. It is obvious that there are certain respected sources of information that can make certain individuals and groups invisible and others invincible. When we choose between becoming better and becoming our own true selves is another question. I may have never asked these questions before. We might even have been totally consumed by escaping, as I did then, and that took me off from my parental home to a different country, where I continued my own education, my way. It was a learning experience and is not suitable for everyone. The word, which is surely known by you, is running away from the hot utensil and falling into the fire. You might know it in different words and order, but it all means just the same. I suppose imaginations really go beyond the two escape routes that we have known, and you can think of various examples of it. For me, running away from the security of one side of my parents and proving that I could make money by part-time jobs and pay my university fees, for instance. But I ended up with the wrong crowd of people and started to hide myself from everybody. It didn't stop my education, though. Nobody knew what I was doing in reality. All they knew was that I was working and feeding my then wife and the child. And they assumed that I was involved faithfully through that wrong company. But I intend not to complain about it, as it was an experience that life has provided me with. However, it ended with disasters. That is a subject on its own, which we can talk about later. It was, in fact, an experience to learn from. I too had a feeling of being odd or lucky, because the possibility was there for an additional way out, while getting a university education and a few more degrees. It was like the vision of a pathway, first towards an interesting career, to become a better husband, better human being, better citizen, and something worthwhile to do, that I could create to fall back on, as my parents would constantly spoke about once. My mother was the only one who literally looked after us. She was a very well-established ladies' dress design and costume creator. She ended up poor due to my father's gambling habits. It was a very depressing state, and I thought of helping my parents in the long run, particularly my mother. But the dark shadows of the blackest company did not make it easy, until I decided to keep my political asylum problems to myself, which I feel not free to talk about, for it is no longer important. However, my dreams have remained steady and never changed as my education continued. As time went on, I discovered a little bit more about humanity and their separatist movements all around the world. In short, I discovered that we all needed to unlearn some of our respect for education, as it did undermine our respect for ourselves. It is now the time to start demystifying it. Science, for a moment, is the most powerful influence on the way our minds work, and our capabilities are valued, and the ways we ourselves value them with. We now rely on the scientific methods to explain our personal experiences are not so timely as we like to think. We are the newcomers in human history. During most of that time of the past, science was conducted within centers of learning, and they were run by the so-called elite, often discouraging secular challenges to religious beliefs in regard to human origins. All we need to do now is really look at the fundamentalist Christian cults, teaching nothing other than creationism in schools. There are other fundamentalists interpreting Judaism, Shintoism, and particularly Islam to comprehend the resistance to any view of humans as part of the continuum of nature. Even the scientists who pursue the secular inquiry were often at great risk, a total rejection of cultural assumptions. It was truly impossible, as it still is. Separatist thinking of races of men were spoken of as by religion to have no souls, and you could be absolutely certain that science would soon discover that they were not evolved enough. This theory came first, and the evidence was mastered afterwards. Not necessarily in dishonest ways, but supposedly as a result of selective vision. In fact, the materialism of the 19th century and travels to other cultures has been weakening the church as the authority. For instance, as in Philippines, the new Catholic Church was introduced and which did not recognize the Pope. But the seductive powers had been inherited. Everywhere, all around the world, they were expected to become the society's explainers, providing rules, justifications. And whenever they were helping the hidden or the non-believers, converting them to Christianity was no longer enough rational. For the colonialism became the pillar of European prosperity, and science was expected to provide compelling reasons for their own good. This was a new interest in separatism by race, in ethnicity, which perhaps given birth to craniology, the parent of many prestigious specialties devoted to documenting and measuring the so-called human differences. Those measurements were of cranial capacity and became a new branch of science, set out to assess the brain size relative development of different areas of the brain, and those assuming the level of intelligence, which, of course, is completely erroneous. Right at the beginning, men were grouped in cranial capacities wherein considered greater the size of the skull, the greater the intelligence. You can laugh if you like I do. Many wide-ranging studies were compared, and the measurements per skull by race and ethnicity by 6. Craniologists were also able to report at the average cranial capacity of the white race was larger than Africans, Asians, and Southern Europeans. Just imagine. From anthropology to neurology, science was demonstrating that a female Victorian virtues of passivity and greater morality, by which was meant less sexual activity, were rooted in female biology. The passive childlike qualities of the darker races were part of their biological destiny. Evolutionists, on the other hand, chime in with a reason for all this. Men who were not Caucasians and women of all races were lower on the evolutionary scale. In the case of race, this was due to simply evolutionary time, since it was believed that European civilizations were the oldest, whereas Caucasian, who obviously had been evolving as long as their male counterparts, there was another explanation. The less complex nervous systems and lower intelligence of females were evolutionary adaptations to the pain of childbirth. And so females of lower races were also assumed to be inferior to their male counterparts. We may truly consider all this as nonsense today, but that is what the world has gone through. Just think about that. Eventually, to keep to the time when craniologists had to modify their focus on sheer brain volume as a primary indicator of intelligence. As it was said, whales, elephants, and other animals with much larger than human brains would have had to be counted as potentially more intelligent than human beings. The obvious response was to take body size into account. But there was an internal split, and the questions remained to how to do it, unanswered. There was no one singular answer, yet admitting to the demand of both logic and politics and the worst scandals, some scientists had just been assuming that the skulls and brains used in laboratory experiments were from male or female cadavers, based on their own totally invented criteria and logic, and others were comparing the wrong numbers within them. Up to 5,000 measurements of one skull. In an effort to save their profession, some craniologists, well, at least one, is returned to simple hierarchy of skull and brain size that was easily understood, admitted the common sense criterion of explaining again the male superiority. However, the new data of our mental patient disclosed to the alarming effect that of these inferior people had larger skulls, as Gloria Steinem explains. I like to talk to you about the inner child who dwells in each of us. Just like Gloria Steinem explained once, somewhere with each of us, depending on the age and degree of neglect or abuse, shame or coercion we endured, there is a resistant, daydreaming, rebellious, creative, unique child who is waiting. Waiting for what? Perhaps to be discovered. Indeed, there is a child within every one of us who needs our care, our love, our attention. But most of the time, we all tend to ignore him or her, forgetting that he or she is indeed our true selves, but behaving like our own offspring and our own beloved pet, and who is invisible to the outside world. Not realizing we all tend, as human beings, ignore that tiny being and not hear its voice within our own conscious self. We tend to accept the traditional teachings and child-rearing principles we have been subjected to. We seem to have that dearest inner child put in a labor camp, where we consider it to be our fate or destiny to live by for the rest of our lives. But it is not necessarily so, because we can free the child from the darkness of the prison camp, where it has been forced to dwell. Remember the old saying? Children are to be seen, but not heard. How sad. What do we need to do now to change all that and free the inner child? Question. You might also ask, why do we need to free that little child? Mona Caird, way back in 1892, has written this: we are governed not by armies and police, but by ideas. For a very long time, all our thoughts in our behavior has gone against our own will and our own selves. Once upon a time, we were told that we had an education, which was the very first step towards self-esteem for many of us. We are not here to learn, but instead to unlearn. Confusing? Not really. We have certainly not been valued by social bias, which was obviously very wrong. However, what happens when this falsehood is taught as the objective truth? Consider this. When the revered sources of knowledge for some groups of people, which are not visible, and others invincible, especially when we are subjected to encouragements to select either improving ourselves and or becoming ourselves. I might not become too popular when I speak of our so-called civilization on this planet, which tend to distort, denigrate, or express for the years following the so-called Western civilization, which promotes hatred against other different-looking people, natives, foreigners, or even females of the so-called civilization. Probably our philosophies, which depend on the so-called gender dualisms, at best and unfortunate gender separations, and viewpoints at worst, following a tradition which are rarely artistic, but perhaps, considering biology and focusing more on the so-called human differences than unhuman possibilities, which usually assume masculine values. And remember, even all the religious viewpoints and tribal deities have always been male with more masculine qualities. There are many valuable books where we learn that almost all power and strength is assigned to male species of humans, and those with blonde hair and blue-eyed males, favored as perfect race. As it has been often mentioned, we tend to see fewer feminine authority as we so-called humans climbed the ladder. Only a few females are favored in the field of science, politics, and business. Have you noticed this? Do we belong then to a wrong race of sexuality, observing not a single one we can identify with? Are we subjective if we consider our own experiences and that the objective truth always seems to lie within the group? But remember, we are not a member of that group, and never were. The so-called groups, social, business, religious, or cultist, promote superiority of their kind. And if you notice, we never belong to it. None of us do. We are truly separated from the other genders, colors, observations, and age groups. The question is why everyone is separate with very degrading or neglected way in education compared to the others. For example, the difference between masculine and feminine species of humanity. Everyone seems to be most definitely separated from their less educated relatives by elite educators, which happens to be of a great part of the same problem. We must therefore understand that the current humanity is divided in every way one can imagine, based upon gender, color, religion, or anything that can be imagined. For instance, only a few natives or females can be observed in authority as we, so-called humans, climb the ladder of educational kind, while we tend to see less and less deans, presidents, scientists, engineers, and politicians. Many are separated from their less supposedly well-educated counterparts, and that happens to be part of the same problem. One might say that we are probably exaggerating the situation, but I feel that we have indeed learned a lot more through philosophy, art, fitness, justice areas of the study, discovering more about our own strength on personal basis, and perhaps needing to rescue that inner child. However, could we all agree that much learning can also be very dangerous? My father used to say, "Don't dig too deep, because underneath it may be wet, or it may give in." There is a truth in it. And with that, let us stop here for this episode. We will meet again by the next episode. Until then, keep smiling, as I always say, and be happy. Thank you.
Oh